Well, thanks for joining us. We're now into chapter 20 as we walk through the book of Matthew. Let's go ahead and start chapter 20, verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you. So they went, going out again about the 6th hour, and the 9th hour he did the same. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing. And he said to them, Why do you stand here idle all day? They said to him, Because no one has hired us. And he said to them, You go into the vineyard too. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first. And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Now when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. But he replied to one of them, Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I chose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first, and the first last. So clearly, when we start chapter 20, we have to remember that these chapter headings, these little section headings that we have in our scriptures, the verse breaks that we have, all of that wasn't in the original text. It wasn't as if Matthew said, okay, chapter 20, verse 1. Matthew didn't write those. Those were put in much later, and they were put in just so it makes it easier for us to go back and define certain sections, and to, when we're talking, when we're teaching, I can say, hey, turn to Matthew 20, you know where to go. If I said, hey, go to the part where, he's talking about the laborers in the vineyard, then you'd have to remember, oh, where was that? And you'd have to struggle to find that in the story. So these are put here for benefit of us to find things. But remember that these are artificial. What we mean by that is we often break up these stories and separate them from the larger context because we say to ourselves in our mind, oh, well, this is chapter 20, that was chapter 19. As we make the transition here from chapter 19 to chapter 20, one of the things that's important for us to recognize is that in verse 16 it says, so the last will be first and the first last. Now, recall that in the last parable or the last story that was in chapter 19, it says at the end of the chapter, but many who are first will be last and the last first. So clearly, Jesus is still speaking on a topic that he was speaking on in chapter 19. So again, we have to look at the context and see how that plays into our understanding of this scripture. Now, recall that in the end of chapter 19, that saying that Jesus gives there, that the first will be last and the last will be first, was given in context of the rich young ruler who goes to Jesus and he says to him, how do I inherit eternal life? And Jesus tells him how to do that. And remember that the problem with this rich young ruler was that he trusted in his riches, and so he had a hard time giving up those riches and then placing his trust in God. And then Peter says, well, we've put our trust in you, and we've given up all these things. And Jesus says, oh, yeah, you've given up all these things, and you're going to be rewarded for doing that. Now, when we get into chapter 20, Jesus is continuing to teach on this topic. And the thing that's really important for us to see here as we look at this is that there's an additional, Jesus is building on what he just talked about, but he's giving us some additional information that should, let's say, make us humble or make us hopeful, depending on which side of this we fall on. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at this. Peter has asked Jesus, well, what's going to happen with us? And he says, hey, if you've left things for us, you're going to receive more. And we talked about the reasoning for that. The reason is that when you start trusting in God, when you enter into a covenant relationship with him, what happens is you understand that everything that God has is yours. Well, that's a great thing. And you say to yourself, well, this is fantastic. If I enter into this covenant and everything that God has is mine, then that's fantastic. That's something to celebrate. That's true. It is something to celebrate. But there's a humility that needs to go with that. And that humility is that you received that not because of the work that you do, but because of the relationship that you have with Father. Now, that's important, and it's actually it's harder to grab a hold of that than we might think, because we have this view of work equals reward. And it's not to say that there's no reward in work, but it's to say that when it comes to our relationship with God, that's not the foundation or the basis for our reward. So think about it this way. Let's say this. Let's say that you're an orphan, and you grow up and you're dirt poor, and you're at an orphanage that has nothing. You don't get really any attention from the staff. You eat gruel every day. There's nothing good happening in your life. You sit in the dirt all day long, and you make dirt pies, and you play in the dirt, and you eat dirt. Yeah, dirt is your existence. You're poor. And let's say that 7 years old, you're 8 years old, 9 years old. We'll make it 10. Let's say you're 10 years old. You've been spent 10 years living in this dirt. And all of a sudden, to your great satisfaction, all of a sudden, somebody, a huge limousine pulls up at the orphanage, and the most richly dressed person you've ever seen gets out, and he walks in and he points to you and says, "I'm adopting you." And he takes you to his home, and you say, "Well, can I swim in the pool?" And he says, "Of course. You're my son. It's your pool now." And you say, "Well, can I jump on the trampoline?" And he says, "Of course you can jump on the trampoline." And all of a sudden, you get an idea that all of a sudden now everything, this is all mine. Because of my relationship to this guy, unlike the servants, this stuff is mine, and that's fantastic. Now, your rich father, he has all kinds of businesses, he has all kinds of things, and he starts to teach you those businesses. He says, "Okay, come on, you're gonna go to work with Dad," and he says, "Okay, I want you to fold these papers." He gives you little tasks and chores that you're capable of. I want you to staple these stacks of papers. I want you to do this. And then as you get older and eventually what happens is you end up kind of learning the ropes and learning business, and you become capable of running businesses, all these things. That's a great thing. Now, the thing that happens while you're going through this process is that this man ends up adopting other kids. And some of these kids get adopted and they're older. And so they haven't done, let's say you turn 30 and, you're running one of his businesses, and let's say he adopts somebody who's 30, and all of a sudden that guy has the same rights as a son that you do. Well, you've been working for Dad for 20 years. And all of a sudden, you can take the Ferrari out with your friends, and you can take the the private jet and take your friends on a trip, and you can. But this guy that just got hired or just got adopted a day ago, he can do the same thing as you. And so you look at this and you say, well, how is this right that this guy hasn't done anything? Now he's going to work with Dad, and Dad's kind of teaching him the ropes and helping him with some skills, but he hasn't done the things that I've done this for 20 years. I've worked for Dad, and so this isn't right. You can imagine that if you were in that position, you might feel that way. How is it right that this new guy comes in and all of a sudden he gets everything that I get? But you're misunderstanding the point. You don't have access to all of those things because you worked for your dad for 20 years. You have access to all of those things because he's your dad. And once somebody becomes part of the family, then they have the same right. They have everything. They're rewarded just like you are. You see, it's really easy to make this mistake. And what Jesus is actually getting at here is something really important, because that's the mistake that the religious leaders constantly make. And that's the mistake that he was addressing in all these other stories and all these other things that are going on previously in these other chapters that we've been covering, is that they misunderstand the nature of their relationship with the Father. They're completely misunderstanding it. The reward you get is not for the work that you do. The reward you get is because of your relationship with the Father. And so what's the reward? The reward is being a son. Well, if somebody's been a son for one day, or if they've been a son for 20 years, they're still a son. And they still have the reward of sonship. And that's the reward that you get when you enter into a covenant with God. And so immediately upon entering the covenant, everything that he has is yours. Everything. There's nothing held back. It's not like, well, you're only kind of a son. You're a son. Now, is that to say that there's no reward in having been a son for 20 years? No, there's great reward. You got the reward of sonship so much earlier. You stopped eating dirt at 10 years old when this 30-year-old only stopped eating dirt 2 days ago. There's great reward in this. But it's not the reward that you think it is. You think it's because of your efforts, and it's not at all. It's because you were adopted as a son, and you should be so thankful that you got to be adopted as a son earlier, and you got to do the great things that the Father is doing, and you got to spend time with him, and you got to be with him as he was doing his work. All of this is really important, and that's the difference in attitude. It's not, I earned this. It's all these blessings came from my relationship with the Father, and I got to experience them for so long. Do you see your work as toilsome? Do you see work in the work that comes from being engaged in your Father's business in his kingdom? Do you see that as toilsome, or do you see that as part of the reward? And that becomes important because there's a great misunderstanding both then and now. And we as Christians aren't immune to misunderstanding the nature of the rewards we get. And it makes a huge difference because, man, you can look at this guy who comes in at 30 years old and gets to be a son, and you can say, oh my goodness, you had to live 30 years without being a son. Man, I feel sorry for you. Welcome into the kingdom. Welcome into this. I'm so glad you get to experience sonship. And I wish you would have been able to do it earlier. Or you can look at it and say, oh, I'm so jealous. Which one is going to be a more fun family to be a part of? The one where you're just so welcoming and you just want to share the blessings with people as they come in, or where you say, who do you think you are coming in here and being a son? I've been doing all this work. Well, it's easy to understand which one is the better option. So it's important for us to see the glory and being a son, that it's not because of the work we do, it's because of the relationship that God's bestowed on us. So hopefully we can be thankful and also welcoming of those who come in. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.